you very much for tuning in to part 2 of this in-depth conversation with Mr. Jeff Nielson from BullionBullsCanada.com. And we certainly appreciate everybody being here. We're going to pick up exactly where we left off in part 1. And thank you very much for listening. And you're right. It's nothing more than organized crime on a global scale. I mean, and it's disgusting. So, if I understand correctly, what you just said is that it's going to be either impossible or pretty darn close to impossible for us to get out of this current mess, as far as the gold and silver market or the gold and silver situation. I'm not even going to call it a market. That's a disgrace to markets.
Well, of course, the point here then becomes a matter of psychology. And if we go back, say, 30 years to when the bankers first crashed the gold and silver market and really began their hardcore era of manipulation, at that time, they were sitting upon enormous stockpiles of gold for sure, and very probably silver as well. And if they had simply chosen to take the markets down to some quasi-rational level and held the prices at that level, they could have maintained this era of manipulation virtually forever, because it would have required very little bleeding off of their own stockpiles to maintain that level of manipulation, given all of the other mechanisms they have to manipulate markets. But of course, they're psychopaths, so they couldn't restrain themselves to simply a moderate level of manipulation. They saw the opportunity for easy profits. Their masters want them to suppress the price. Well, they could simply, the psychopaths working for these banker oligarchs would simply crash the markets down faster and harder and drive the prices even lower so they could reap more profits off of their shorting. And it was just, a matter of criminals being drunk on power. They could push the market down, so they would push the market down, and they would push it lower and lower and lower. And of course, we had the famous incident going back to around 2000, when the Bank of England was forced to dump 1/3 of England's total gold reserves onto the market at the absolute rock bottom price for the gold market. And they were forced to do that because the psychopaths at Goldman Sachs had overextended themselves so ridiculously on their shorting that Goldman Sachs would have been vaporized if the Bank of England hadn't stepped in and dumped all that bullion onto the market to bail them out of their overextension. So, I mean, picture this. We have criminals who are totally in control of the marketplace, and they still manipulate themselves into a position where they're on the verge of self-destruction. So these are the people we're dealing with. And so, of course, this is why we see Russia and China sitting back passively, doing nothing to provoke the psychopaths in the West. They're not even doing anything to provoke them in the bullion markets. They just sit back and purchase relatively moderate quantities of gold every month, and presumably silver as well, although the market's somewhat murkier there. And they just keep adding and adding. And of course, they let the bankers work for them. What is the implication to Russia and China when we see gold at a 6-year low? It means that when they dump their U.S. treasuries to buy gold with them, they can buy even more ounces of gold. Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what we're seeing. I mean, that, and what you just described is exactly what we're seeing. I mean, they're just kicking back and letting it unfold. I mean, and that's really, and as Chris Powell pointed out in an interview that Dave Kranzler and I did with him a few months ago, they aren't buying gold for the people. They aren't buying it because they're benevolent. They're acquiring all of this gold and silver, in my opinion, for the specific purpose of having the power, of having the control. Because once they have enough, once they feel comfortable with their acquisitions, they're going to unleash that. They're going to unleash that knowledge. And I still go back to Alistair McLeod and his research showing very clearly that China could very, very easily have 20 to 25,000 tons of gold without even a flinch or without any question on his analysis, because he's very conservative about what he's done. And if they do in fact have that, then we must be approaching something to where their comfort level is would allow them to be able to make the announcement, or am I just way off base with that?
Well, I think the point here is that China and Russia are not trying to overthink and overplan things.
Okay.
We're all ourselves expecting the next shoe to drop. We're expecting something big to happen, simply because, as we see in virtually every facet of our economies, the psychopaths are on the verge of complete self-destruction. And so, we can talk about the impossible situation in our so-called markets, but the salvation there is that the people who are in charge are inherently self-destructive, and they are guaranteed to destroy themselves. So, and like personally, I have much more conservative numbers for what I peg China's current gold deposits at. I would put it more along the lines of between 4,000 and 5,000 tons, possibly above that, depending on what they've done in the open market behind the scenes. But the point here is it's not so much a matter of how many thousands of tons Russia has in absolute terms, or China has in absolute terms, but it's a matter of proportion. And the West basically has no gold. They pretend to have lots, but we know that it's all been bled onto the market with their fraudulent leasing. They have official title to these tens of thousands of tons of gold, but the gold isn't there. It belongs to other people. And that fraud, of course, too, will soon come out into the open. So in that respect, if the West has no gold, it doesn't really matter whether China has 5,000 tons or 25,000 tons. It is still the central power in terms of gold. And of course, with Russia, it doesn't really matter whether it has 3,000 tons or 15,000 tons. It's kind of number two. So at that point, if the majority of gold is being held in those Eastern powers, it doesn't really matter whether it's a total of 10,000 tons or a total of 30,000 tons, because that's just a function of price. Whether we have a gold standard with the price of gold at, let's use the fantasy number of $1,000 an ounce. I mean, dollars don't mean anything anymore, versus a gold standard with a price of gold at $20,000 an ounce. It's whatever quantity of gold exists, you can create a gold standard on it, because the standard is simply a function of the price and supply.
Exactly.
So in this respect, we know that the majority of gold is shifting from west to east. We don't need to know the precise quantities. We just need to know that it's a complete shift. There's basically nothing left in the West. The East has the gold. The golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules. But as I've indicated before, even here, we're not going to see anything precipitous and dramatic from China. They can't simply move directly from this phony, fraudulent U.S. dollar hegemony of worthless paper currencies to a gold-backed renminbi, because that would create this disorderly stampede out of the fraudulent U.S. system into the legitimate Chinese system. So the transition that's now taking place between the paper dollar and the paper renminbi has to continue. China may unofficially already have enough gold to back the renminbi, but it won't do so officially until it seizes the reins of power more or less completely. And at that point, it's already the world will have made an orderly transition to the renminbi, and then it can announce that it's reinstituting some sort of gold standard, and there won't be that disorderly stampede. Because it serves Russia and China no purpose at all for themselves to precipitate such a stampede, even though it would destroy their enemies in the West. Because the problem is, in the stampede into Russia's and China's currencies, those currencies would appreciate so extremely and rapidly in value that this would cause different types of disruptions in their own economies. Okay. So it's in everybody's best interest that the transition be orderly and non-antagonistic. And certainly that's the intention of Russia and China. It's, of course, the psychopaths in the West that are looking to create conflict, looking to create destruction and chaos, and then, of course, hoping they can hang on to their corrupt empire when we emerge from the rubble.
Well, I don't see that happening at all, because I don't think that the U.S. can beat China and Russia on any playing field. I really don't. I mean, as far as,
except militarily.
I disagree. I disagree. I don't think that the U.S. can beat China and Russia as a duo against the West. I don't see that happening. I think that their
not in conventional.
firepower is. I think they have things that we know about, and then I think that both countries have, just like the U.S. has military capability that is unknown.
Well, I fully agree with you that there's no way that the West could hope to launch and win any sort of conventional East-West global war. But as we know from these insane neocons in the U.S., they're no longer thinking in terms of conventional war. I mean,
Right.
they're talking about strategic and tactical use of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And of course, this is what terrifies Russia and China, is they realize they're dealing with psychopaths.
Yes.
And psychopaths are inherently self-destructive in their obsession with getting what they want and maintaining control and maintaining power. They are fully capable of totally destroying themselves and everybody else around them. And so this is the reality that China and Russia have been dealing with, going back, of course, to the 9/11 false flag event, when the West, became openly fascist and openly aggressive towards the rest of the world, and became ultra militaristic.
Yes.
And that was the wake up call for everybody. And certainly it was for Russia and China, and we've seen how they've reacted passively as chess players, working on improving their positioning and simply outmaneuvering the West to a greater and greater extent. And of course, we see this with the ISIS boogeymen, and Russia's brilliant gambit of quickly moving their own military into Syria and taking on ISIS and immediately rolling it back with their own airstrikes to expose it as nothing but this U.S. puppet organization, which the West was only pretending to fight. We have the U.S. talking about how it's been taking on ISIS for the last 3 years, and yet ISIS gets bigger. And we have Russia moving it into military into Syria, and then in a few weeks it does more than the U.S. did in several years.
Yep.
So that immediately exposed the U.S. to anybody who was paying attention. And now, of course, after they did the false flag attack in Paris,
Yep.
We had Russia immediately reaching out to France as "quote unquote" an ally. We're allies against ISIS, and I thought that was such a brilliant maneuver by Putin, because it put the West in a no-win position. They either have to refuse to cooperate with Russia, which will make their supposed war against ISIS even more questionable in the eyes of people, or they will work with Russia in jointly destroying the U.S.'s own group of thugs. So for Russia, that was a no-lose scenario, and they created basically a no-win scenario for the West. And so this is why we see the West shooting down a Russian jet,
Yes.
to try to stoke conflict, to try to make it impossible for Russia to cooperate with these psychopaths. But Putin, of course, is remaining calm, remaining moderate, and just refusing to allow himself to be provoked by this obvious warmongering from the West.
Well, and Oland and Putin are meeting right now to discuss how to destroy ISIS, with or without the United States, with or without NATO. Those two are meeting to agree on a plan of action, which, like you were just saying, puts the remainder of the West and the NATO allies in a very peculiar position of either supporting this situation and exposing themselves, or not supporting it and truly exposing who the real criminal is, and who ISIS is, and where they came from. I mean, the U.S. actually had bombers to drop flyers onto an oil tanker field where ISIS was moving their illegal crude oil out, and they had the bombers to drop these flyers saying, "Get out, we are going to bomb you. We're going to bomb this field right here where all of these trucks are at." And they gave them a 45-minute heads up. And then 45 minutes later, they came in, bombed it, and of course, almost no casualties.
Well, and then along those same lines, there was this video clip released on some other site. I can't remember whose site it was, but it was a clip which apparently showed U.S. Aircraft flying ground support for ISIS.
Yes.
Not attacking them, but they're being their air power backing.
Convoy,
and
yeah.
And escort. And so,
escort,
I mean, this is the point. Every day that this conflict goes on, we see the West eroding its own moral legitimacy in the world.
Yes.
And of course, once again, this is something that is an inherent trait with psychopaths. They can only maintain the guise of being reasonably moderate and legitimate for so long before their true colors show through. And so, this is what we're seeing is that, the wolf is totally out of its sheep's clothing. And everybody can now see the wolf for what it is. And of course, now the wolf doesn't know what to do.
Exactly. One last question, then I'm going to let you get back to your morning. How about that?
Sure, no problem.
I want to circle back to China and the go back yuan and Russia's role. As you well know, just within a couple of weeks, we're going to find out from the IMF whether or not the yuan renminbi is going to be included in the basket of currencies for the SDR, and that's a pretty big deal. Or is it? But the question that I have is, if the renminbi yuan is included, how will that impact the next couple of years, do you think, as far as the direct currency swaps that China already has in place and their stated goal is to have the renminbi as not a reserve currency, but as the primary currency used around the world in global trade? I mean, will that help them bring about a gold-backed currency, or are all these things just completely disconnected one from another?
Well, I might turn out to be proven totally wrong here, but my own perspective is that all of the posturing with the West regarding this so-called, SDR and possibly trying to morph that into some sort of currency, it's just, irrelevant. It's the desperate ploy of a fading empire to grasp at some way to maintain legitimacy. And I don't see any incentive for any of the world's nations to buy into this. Everyone can now see that the move from a Western-based monetary system to an Eastern-based monetary system is not only well underway, it's irreversible.
Right.
So who cares what Western bankers say? Who cares what they want to do? Who cares what they're planning to do? It's like if Jamaica announced, plans to form a new currency, an international currency, and it was debating whether or not to include China in this basket. Would anybody care? So,
excellent point.
This is how I view these bankers now. They've turned themselves in many respects into paper tigers. They still have the important levers of power. The most important, the controls over our governments, the controls over the markets. But, they've eroded so much of their ancillary mechanisms for maintaining power, primarily through destroying their own empire. They've cannibalized their own empire over this last generation of looting. And, this is another thing that Russia and China can easily see. And it's like, well, why should we work to overtly take down the West when, the West is doing such a good job of it on their own?
Yeah. That's excellent point. Because once again, all they have to do is just sit back and watch, from the luxury
and try to avoid being destroyed as the West takes itself down.
Well, I mean, and they already have in place the parallel systems, the parallel infrastructure, financial, monetary infrastructure between Russia and China. Both. I mean, they both have independent systems, and they both are running parallel to the SWIFT system in the West, the credit card systems in the West, the IMF, the banking systems in the West, they have all of that in place. All of it.
And this is so important because, of course, if Russia and China had not had enough time to create these parallel institutions, with the West obviously about to take us into some, Armageddon scenario in economic terms, we could have been facing utter chaos. All of our institutions imploding in fraud and debt and all the rest, and nothing to replace it. But now, of course, we have these quote unquote parallel institutions, and Russia and China call them parallel today. And of course, they must snicker behind the scenes when they use that word, because they're not parallel institutions; they're replacement institutions.
Exactly.
And they're what the world is going to move into when the West has finished destroying itself. And hopefully, if Russia and China can maintain enough control over the scenario in some sort of reasonably orderly manner. So this ironically is our hope in the West, that the sober governments in Russia and China will manage to hold things together well enough that our own leaders will not totally annihilate our way of life, and will be able to retain some sort of shred of our current standard of living.
We can only hope. I mean, which is why we have to, as individuals, we have to have gold and silver in our own personal vaults, wherever that vault may be. But we have to have it. Otherwise, we're just going to be washed away, just like the rest of it. And when I say washed away, I don't mean in a tidal wave, but in this, as Catherine Austin Fitts calls it, the slow burn. The slow burn, or the slow transfer, would be a better way of saying it, from west to east, because everything is moving in that direction. And at some point, and I believe it's going to happen in my lifetime, that we're going to see gold and silver as currency and as money, period. I mean, they've always been money, but I believe that we're going to see it as currency once again, and I believe that's going to happen in my lifetime. So
certainly that's my expectation as well. And of course, the more completely that the Western oligarchs destroy our system, the more certain it is that this will be a reality, because there will be nothing else to replace it.
Right.
It will be literally the only option left. We'll have, of course, there will be, once the bankers have finished destroying our system, there will be no faith in any of their paper instruments. And of course, the banks themselves will presumably be regarded as the predators and parasites that they are. And at that point, there will be an appetite for something legitimate, for something real, for something that can't be corrupted by bankers.
Correct. And there's only two instruments that have stood the test of time. I mean, and that's silver and gold. Silver's been money longer than gold, and I believe that its time is just around the corner. How long that corner is, I don't know, but I believe it's just around the corner. Like I said, in my lifetime, I believe that we're going to see that. So, but we've been speaking with Mr. Jeff Nielson, who is the co-owner, I believe, of the BullionBullsCanada.com website. And you can find all of his great work over there. And you can find him also at SprottMoney.com. And Jeff, is there anything that you would like to leave the folks with at this point?
No, I think we've given them plenty to chew on for today, Rory. It's always a pleasure having these chats with you, and I hope to be back again soon.
Well, we'll do it again real soon. I can assure you of that.
Sounds great.
All right.